Well, I think we should go ahead and get started. People will be able to join as we go. So I think we will, if everyone is in agreement. My name is Maureen Wilson, and I am representing a group called ZeroWasteColumbia, and we are pleased to present you with this program tonight. I wanted to acknowledge everyone who helped make this program possible. Our host, the Columbia County Library Association, and especially Thea Shoup, director of the Claverack Free Library. I would like to just give you a word about ZeroWasteColumbia. We are a citizen volunteer group committed to education and action, moving us towards zero waste in Columbia County. Our members are also active participants in our town climate smart communities, town councils, and the Columbia County Environmental Management Committee, as well as other members. Zero waste, just to explain, means that we're striving to send nothing to the landfill. You may have heard this refrain before. Reduce what we need, reuse as much as possible, minimize what we recycle, and of course, compost for your garden. We'd also like to interest you in composting on a grander scale. We envision what is possible, bringing your food scraps and yard waste to other sites in the county if you are not able to do it at home. Those possibilities include community gardens, farmers markets, and now our transfer stations. Presently, there is a pilot program at all of the transfer stations in Columbia County where you can bring your suitable food waste to be composted. We are delighted to have our speaker for tonight, Jean Bonhotal. She will give us an overview of what is involved in composting and why it is important. Jean is a waste management specialist and a director of Cornell Waste Management Institute in Soil and Crop Sciences. She has spent over 25 years in education of composting, not only composting food, but also manure, animal carcasses, and compost quality and use. Thank you so much, Jean, for taking the time to join us this evening.
You're welcome. This is a fairly informal presentation. I will keep my camera off because we keep a better signal that way. So I'll just have a picture there. But feel free to interrupt, write questions in the chat if you want to steer the conversation in a different direction. I'm fine with that. So I'd really like this to be a good discussion tonight, and I'll teach you a little bit about composting and getting composting to work in your community. Zero waste, Maureen was just referring to zero waste, and it is a little bit pie in the sky because it's a hard thing to do. To really be zero waste because there are so many things that we have, but composting a large portion of our waste stream actually helps a lot to make us more in terms of zero waste, getting to zero waste. A lot of our waste stream, and these are just basic numbers, about 60% of our waste stream is organic, and that doesn't include human biosolids or livestock manure. So it's an interesting number that we have here because those don't include any of that. And these numbers really don't change too much as far as food scraps and things like that, because we don't have a good way of assessing a number. So you can see these are 2009 figures, but we can't assess what you keep at home. So we can do it through a survey or something like that for food scraps, yard trimmings, for all that kind of stuff, but we really can't get good numbers on some of our organics. But our organics include paper and food scraps, yard trimmings, wood, leather, rubber, and textiles. I am working on a research project to compost denim right now. And when it's at the end of its life, what do we do with it? Does it have any negative effects from dyes or anything like that? And so we're looking into some of that, and we've looked into a lot of other materials in the past. So we're looking at all those. We have 3 pieces of the pie here that we have to do still, and those are the things that need to be recycled. Those are glass, metals, plastics. And a lot of plastics cannot be recycled. And things may change a little bit with plastics recycling right now because of the prices of fuel. So we may actually be commissioning plants that can make take plastic and turn it into a fuel or oil or whatever. So that might be something that will come about. We've tried to do that more and more, but it's problematic. So with the prices of fuel right now, I expect things to change a little bit in that respect on these pieces of the pie. US EPA is a strong advocate for composting as much as we possibly can, including food waste. And there's a food recovery hierarchy here. And one of the things that we really want to do is reduce, source reduction. And source reduction really is meal planning, restaurant meal planning, so that you don't have waste, that you don't have those leftovers that end up in the garbage. The next thing we want to do is to feed hungry people. We have food banks, we have soup kitchens, and restaurants and cafeterias and things like that that have excess, that can't plan down to the exact meal, oftentimes can divert some of those meals to feed people. And that's a really important thing. Feeding animals, so feeding livestock is a possibility, and there's strong support for that, but a lot of livestock need a guaranteed feed analysis. And so we supplement some of the feed with that, with some of the food waste, but it can't have like glass and plastic and metal and things like that, gloves, rubber gloves, things like that in it if animals are going to be eating it. So we have to be kind of careful with that. We do have some feed mills that use food scrap, I would say, to make feed for animals. And we're usually talking about cows, goats, pigs, animals like that. Horses, it's a little bit tougher. So industrial uses. We have to use all parts of our waste, and there's waste oils in particular. I was in Mongolia looking at their meat waste to see what more we could be using there and reducing any waste that there might be. They use a lot of the parts of the animals, but one thing that they weren't using was rendered oils. So when the meat was cooked down, the sheep fat and goat fat was cooked down, they actually had a lot of oil, and it was just dumped on the ground. They don't like the taste of it, so it's not used for cooking, but they can use it for a fuel source. So that's something that will change, and we need to look at that in every country. We need to look at things like that, okay, there's a big amount of waste that's going this way. Maybe we can be doing something else with that so that it doesn't become a waste product. Composting, of course, and we'll be talking about that mostly tonight. And landfill and incineration. Those are the last things that we really want to do, is send things to landfill or incinerate. And we do have incinerators in New York State. I don't think Columbia County has access to an incinerator, do they? Anybody know?
I don't think so, Jean. I
I don't
don't.
think
I think
so.
we send everything out. But I'm
Out
not,
to a landfill out of county?
I believe so, yeah.
And where does Columbia County's waste go to?
I don't know. And I may be incorrect about that. I know that
Yeah, I don't know
there
if
are
our
things that go out. I do know that.
yeah, you may be sending stuff to Seneca Meadows. I'm not sure. I don't know. I know most counties, but I don't know Columbia County in particular. So anyway, it's got to be trucked. So why compost? Organic material is a large portion of the waste stream. We mentioned that. When we compost it, we actually reduce the volume by about 50%. And that's helpful because otherwise we'd be buried in organics. And the organics really need to go back into the soil, not into a landfill, not into other places, but they have to continue that loop and go into back into the soil so that we can build good soil. Compost has beneficial microbes, and that helps build the soil. If we don't put any organic matter back in the soils, we really are treating our soils like dirt. So they really need that organic matter so that they can be sustainable and that they can grow good food, good healthy food for us. One of the most important things, I think, especially with climate change or whatever we want to call it, but you know, the earth seeming to be warming, and soils drying out, is we need to be putting the organic matter back into that, because that acts like a sponge. The organic matter acts like a sponge and keeps the soil moisture where the plants can use it. And that's a really important asset to composting, to using compost. It's probably the most, because we really are using a lot of chemical fertilizer and not using a lot of compost. And when we do that, we're really bankrupting our soil, because our soils cannot sustain. We're not getting enough rain, or we're getting too much rain. So we have to balance that, and compost piles or compost actually will absorb things. It improves soil quality. Organic matter fills up landfills and creates leachate and all that kind of stuff, so that's not helpful. And it's really converted into a soil-like product. Making and using compost equals healthy soil, equals good food, equals healthy people. And that's a pretty important thing for us to be looking at. Food security is an important aspect in almost all communities now. People are looking at, you know, community gardens, having community gardens, and being able to grow good food for people that are food insecure, and the rest of us who just want good food, healthy food. Yeah. Got a transfer. Okay, hold on. There we go. There are all types of compost feedstocks, and we put this list together throughout the US, and it's an interesting list. That's why I put it up for you, but it is all different things that we've been asked to compost. We can compost anything that was once alive and is now dead and needs to be managed. And that's my definition of organics. Not the strict organic soils and crops, but really things that were alive now can be managed. And you'll see we have everything, including milk waste, meat waste, bakery waste, pits, seeds, all the way down to like gummy vitamin residuals. So we really do compost the gamut of materials that are considered food. Composting is a process. And I'll say this probably many times tonight because it's a process. It takes time. It converts organic waste into a usable product that's healthy for plants and soil. I sent some posters to people in Columbia County, I think to Susan.
Yes.
And she will have some of those posters on at the Climate Festival.
Yeah,
in
the
July.
Columbia County Climate Carnival, which I forgot to mention, we can mention again at the end, but yes, that's where it will be.
Yeah, so we have those, and today I actually saw Maureen and I gave her some more posters on compost use that you'll see some of that in this. But this is just a quick crib notes for how do we compost, what ingredients are good, how do we layer things in, what types of containers do we need to turn, and what makes that compost happen. So we'll look at a little bit at organisms. We'll look at the composting process, feedstocks, which we just saw a whole list of, and different types of containers, and then uses for compost. When we make compost, we're getting to climate neutral. So we're not letting, we don't produce methane, but we do produce carbon dioxide. And we'll talk about that a little bit. But methane isn't generally a part of it. But when we actually use compost, our carbon footprint goes up by a lot. So we have to make sure that we're making it and we're using it. So we've got all the workers here in the composting process. And I usually tell people that they really need to be microbe farmers when they want to make compost. So you're creating a habitat for microbes to do the work. It isn't the sun that makes compost. It's not a heat source from outside that makes compost. It's the metabolism from all of these microorganisms that actually make compost. They're working together, they're giving off heat, and there are billions and trillions of them. So they do a good job with that. We have to provide food, shelter, and moisture. I had a grad student some years back that actually liked the micro footage of compost organisms. So she went ahead and took a lot of photographs, a lot of footage, video footage, and we actually turned it into a video, vermicomposting, a living soil amendment. So vermicomposting is one of those. It's on YouTube. It's on our website. There's a link to it on our website as well. And so explore that. Use it for teaching. If you're working with kids, it's fascinating to see how everything works, how worms work together when they come into the process, and all the different microbes and macrobes that actually make the composting process happen.
Excuse me, Jean, we had a question.
Yeah.
Which I actually wondered about it too. I think you said that our footprint, our carbon footprint goes up when we compost. Can you explain that a little bit?
No, our carbon footprint is better when we compost. So, but oftentimes when we compost or we divert our materials to composting, we've got to count the fuel that it takes to drive the material there or bike it there. If we're biking it there, there's no fuel. We have to look at all the inputs. If it's being turned, then there's usually diesel fuel involved, and there is some carbon use there. So what we need to do is when we compost, there's so much benefit from the actual compost process that we can negate some of the other carbon uses. When we use compost, we're actually taking that carbon and mixing it into the soil, and that gives us a big bump of carbon footprint. So it improves our carbon footprint when we actually are using the compost.
Thank you.
So my fungi is an important part of the process. It breaks down woody waste, lignins, and it is important. It's important to have those mushrooms, different types of mushrooms and funguses in the compost pile, so that the process actually works. Worms are a portion of the process that happens actually later. We have vermicomposting, and those are surface dwelling worms. So they can handle warmer temperatures, and they can be in the edges of compost piles, but they won't go into a compost pile until the compost pile is actually partially processed, because they can't tolerate the organic acids that are in a compost pile. So there's a lot of organic acids in there, and we need to just, there isn't any big deal with that. That's a natural process, but the worms actually will come in later. And there was a book called Worms Eat My Garbage, and really it should be renamed to say Worms Eat the Microorganisms That Eat My Garbage, because that's really what is happening in there. There's a whole food chain of critters that are making us compost. Okay, so the process, I'm listing just a few feedstock here, and food waste, food processing waste, manures, weeds, you can read those. We label those, and we have them in two different colors, like manure has brown and green letters in it, because it's an easy way for us to talk about carbon and nitrogen. The brown is carbon, the green is nitrogen. And when we put those things together, that helps a lot. The brown is also dry, and the green is generally has more moisture in it. So that helps. For instance, when we have grass clippings, those are green and they're highly nitrogenous, and they tend to slime. They tend to really get stinky. If we cut our hay out in the field, which is happening right now, we let it dry, that's got more carbon in it, actually, because of the moisture loss there. There's more carbon, and so we treat that as a carbon. So hay is more like a carbon, fresh grass clippings are more like a nitrogen. The composting process, this is just a little chemistry for tonight. We won't go too far into anything, but we have all of our food waste, our yard waste, our organic residuals. They're in the middle box there. We add microbes. Do we need to add microbes to our composting process? Anybody want to answer that one?
No.
No.
I don't think we do.
Okay, so we really don't need to add microbes to the compost, because those microbes are everywhere. They're on our skin. I can grow pretty good stuff in my refrigerator, and I'm not trying to. So I get moldy cheese in the back, something that's gotten pushed back to the back of the fridge. So we really don't need to add a lot of microbes. If we've sterilized our compost, which can happen, then I usually tell people to throw some manure in it, and that will bring it back, and all the gut organisms from an animal will get that biome working again. Microbes breathe oxygen just like you and I. So they need oxygen, they need a source of oxygen. And if they're in a very wet pile, oxygen can't get into that. And they need moisture. So moisture can come in the form of snow, rain, food waste, food scraps, liquid manures, different ways. And it produces products. Compost, humus, carbon dioxide. What needs carbon dioxide? Our plants need carbon dioxide to photosynthesize. So sometimes we'll take the carbon dioxide from a compost facility and actually shunt it into a greenhouse where that carbon dioxide is needed. So if you can arrange that, organize that, that's a good thing to be able to do. It also gives off a lot of heat. Our composts are 130 to 150, 60 degrees Fahrenheit. That's a lot of heat. And we have some composting systems that actually can draw the heat from the process, and we can use it to heat hot water, to turn into electricity, to use. And that's an important thing. We do have several systems in the Northeast that we do heat hot water and circulate that through floors, or use it for wash water or other needs. And moisture. You're always going to see steam coming off of the large compost piles. So that's in the winter, especially, or when a cool morning, you'll see steam coming off, and that steam, the water comes off in the form of steam.
Jean, another question. Why would someone want to sterilize their pile?
We don't usually try to sterilize compost piles, but sometimes if we have a combination of feedstocks that has a very high value, we can get to 170, 180. We can have spontaneous combustion in our compost piles, especially if we have a lot of woody waste in there. So we have to be a little bit careful. Generally not in the Northeast. We don't generally have a lot of fires in our composts, but we can end up with a hot compost if we're composting meat waste, for instance. And about half of the work that I do is carcasses and response to disease issues. So we compost critters, and those composts can get pretty high. We also have a lot of moisture in those, so we don't have that problem, but we can sterilize. If it gets too hot, your process will just shut down. The microbes just are killed. They're killed off.
Thank you.
Sometimes we do sterilize compost. We even heat treat compost. But that's not the best value for compost. We really want those microbes to be alive and to work into the soils and build our soils. So I'm going to talk more about carbon and nitrogen than anything else tonight. So nitrogen is the green materials, the colorful materials generally. If we have too much nitrogen in a pile, a very wet pile, and we have maybe poultry manure or food or grass clippings, we're liable to give off a lot of ammonia. And really what I want to do with my ammonia, with my nitrogen, is I want to keep it in the pile. So I want to make sure that I'm mixing my carbon and nitrogen properly so that I can keep that in the pile. And I want to have, when I'm doing that, I want to have 3 parts of carbon to 1 part of nitrogen. And that's not exact because different things have different moisture, but I'll show you a slide that will depict that in a minute. So if we have too much nitrogen, we're going to have odor. We're going to have ammonia volatilizing. We're going to have more problems. And a lot of times people are like, well, I just put all my organic material out in a pile and I don't add any carbon. I don't have carbon. Well, we have so many leaves, and leaves can be stockpiled, put in bags and put out by your compost pile, so that you can add them at different times of the year. Because we won't have a lot in the winter. So we want to be able to cover all of our materials in the winter as well. Carbon, the brown materials. So if we have too much carbon, one of the examples I use, if I have a whole pile of sticks and no nitrogen to go with that pile of sticks, and I come back in a year, I'm going to have a pile of sticks. So nothing's really going to happen. Not much is really going to happen to that. I've got to add nitrogen to that carbon so that I can actually make the compost process work. There are different different values, and these are just some examples of high nitrogen materials and high carbon materials. And I like to show this one because it has the last four on the list are all wood waste: bark, paper, sawdust, and logs. And they all have very, very different carbon and nitrogen ratios. And that has to do with the availability of the carbon. And, you know, if you have a log, is that carbon very available? No. If you have sawdust, that carbon is, the microbes can get in and around that, but they might not be able to get enough air in the sawdust to function well. So we look at bark and wood chips and municipal wood chips, and they're the best thing really to compost with in many situations, especially municipal situations. So as I was saying, we have our 3 buckets, and it can be cottage cheese containers or 5-gallon buckets or loader buckets or, you know, things like that. It's just 3 of the carbon and 1 of the nitrogen. And that makes our compost work well generally. So we have different simple types of containment. And I like wire bins, and I just gave Maureen a wire bin to be able to use at the climate fair festival. And what we do is we put carbon on the bottom, then we put a layer of nitrogen, then we put a layer of carbon, we put a layer of nitrogen. I'm a lazy composter, so I don't tend to turn my materials because I don't have time, and I have a lot of composts in different places. So I set mine up so that they are passively aerated. Having the carbon on the bottom allows the air to get into that, and the air will circulate around the food, and the microbes will be able to do the work that we want them to do. So all carbon is not created equal. I won't belabor that any further, but we need to make sure that we have the right sizes. I do a lot of work, as I said, in mortality composting. And with mortality composting, we use a nice municipal wood chip. We make an envelope around that cow, and the cow lays right in the center there. So I put 24 inches of carbon down on the bottom, on the base, and that creates an air plenum. I put the cow in, and I cover it with 24 inches of material. And in about 3 months, that cow will disappear, except for the bones, the big bones. They'll be around for a little bit, but I can make things disappear just by making an envelope of carbon around it, so that the microbes that are on and in that animal will actually digest the animal. We have really high-tech methods for detecting moisture and temperature. We don't do a lot of testing of our composting. We actually regulate by process in New York State. So we want to make sure that we're doing it right, that we're preparing, you know, putting the carbon and nitrogen layers in. We're doing turning if it requires turning. If it doesn't require turning, we're just setting things up right. So I'll take a handful of material, and I'll do the squeeze test. And when I'm doing that, some people call it the meatball test also. I've heard that more recently. But I'll pick up a handful of material, and I'll squeeze that. And if water runs down my arm, there's too much moisture there, and I need to add more carbon to that mixture. If I open up my hand and it forms a nice ball, then I have a perfect medium to compost. And if I open up my hand and it blows away, I need to add more nitrogen to it. So I need more moisture, more nitrogen, so that it actually can be the right moisture content to be able to process. When we're layering materials in, I just make sure that I have wet, dry, or dry, wet, dry, wet, dry, wet, so that everything has contact with moisture. And I also water my compost. I add water to them in the compost bucket when I'm dumping the compost bucket. And thermometers. Thermometers can tell you pretty much anything that's going on in your compost pile. We generally will use them for larger scale composting. Small composts, if they're less than 4 by 4 by 4 cubed, that mass, we're not really going to be able to generate much heat, mostly because we live in the north and it's cold in the winter. And we don't want to be, we can often freeze our piles because we just don't have the mass that we need to compost. So that begs for us to be composting with our neighbors and having community composts. So that is a very positive thing, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. I'm getting into containers, different containers that can be used, and you'll see the wire bin again. We also use, I like to use my juice drums this way. And what we do with the juice drums, this happens to be in Haiti. I was working with kids to make compost. And what we do is we take these big 30, 40 gallon juice drums, we drill holes in them, and then we fill them with carbon and nitrogen, carbon, nitrogen, carbon, nitrogen, till the whole bin is filled. And then these guys were actually rolling those bins around the track. So it was a good way for them to burn off some steam themselves. And the compost was turned that way. And these make really good compost. In the West, I've seen them used a lot in outhouses for human manure even. And I've seen people doing that way to sanitize their manure. We also can have, use cinder block type, and I generally use old cinder blocks and then turning if we want to incorporate more air into that pile. So different bins. I like wire bins. These are relatively small wire bins, so a little bit smaller than I would want to compost in. But you can fill these with leaves. You can fill them with leaves and food waste. And there's a lot of air that's able to move around that medium, so we can compost in a wire bin. I like pallets, old pallets. Make sure they're relatively clean, and you can generally tell by some of the writing on pallets if they've been pressure treated or sprayed or anything like that. But pallets are great to be reused. And you see that these actually have hook and eyes on them. And you can actually take the front door off so that you can turn it if you wish. Or you can take that whole bin when you've finished filling it, you can take that bin and move it next to itself and fill it up again. And the first pile will process itself. We have a 2-can composter that I use sometimes in the winter in my basement. And a 2-can composter is a 50-gallon garbage can. And I usually will use a metal 50-gallon garbage can, and then put a 30-gallon inside of that with holes in it. And you'll poke holes in that. And then when you place that 30-gallon bin in there, you're going to put either some sticks or some logs or something to raise it off the bottom a little bit. And then the air will be able to circulate around that whole medium that's in that plastic garbage can, 30-gallon garbage can. They work pretty well. And when you can't get material out to your compost bins because there's too much snow or something, it works. And it holds the materials, doesn't smell, because you've got your carbon and your nitrogen, carbon and nitrogen. These rotating drums, I'm not a tremendous fan of rotating drums because they're off the ground and they tend to run a lot colder than something that's in touch with the ground. These are like 100-gallon drums. And this school actually found these drums on eBay. and they cost like $500 to $1,000 each. And they were able to get them cheap on eBay because the people that were using them didn't know how to use them and needed to get rid of them. So they were resourceful in their management. The students, it's a middle school, and the students will fill one of those bins, make a batch out of it. So, and the paper lunch bags could go in there, leaves, food. And then after they filled up the bin, then they actually, it has a handle on it and they can turn that bin. So this school has, I think, 4 or 5 of these bins. 3-bin systems are really great. And it's good because you fill up your first bin, then you can, after that's filled, you can turn it into the next bin. And you also can hold some of your carbon in the 3rd bin. So when winter comes and you need carbon, you'll have a stockpile of it in that 3rd bin, and you'll be able to keep your compost going well. Community composting. We have community composting in a lot of our cities, in other countries as well. This happened to be some group that I was working with in India. And the women who are actually running the whole facility, bringing in the food waste, mixing it and making all the compost, and the compost was going out to the farms when they were finished with it. So they were really looking, really sustainably recycling all of their nutrients. We're doing the same thing in community gardens. This is the top picture is the ESF. There's a Cayuga compost that has composting going on. And one person can be doing it and other people are bringing materials in. We have 3-bin systems that we use with the schools in New York. And these 3-bin systems are designed so that the school can divert their cafeteria wastes to these. The students aren't the ones that in the long term are going to be running them, because that's not the student's job, but they get a better understanding of what, you know, of how the process works, using composting as a tool. And so having these types of bins in the schools is pretty important so that they can understand all of that. Sorry, the phone is ringing. We have plans on our website for these. They're there for free. Everything on our website is available, and feel free to use it to teach other people, use my slides, doesn't matter. When we design these bins, they're not all 6 by 6 by 6. When it's at a school, we want to use the size bucket that the school has. So if it has a 4-foot bucket, we're probably going to make those bins 4 by 4 by 4, or maybe a little bit bigger than that, 5 by 5 by 5. So we can use their bucket loader to turn those piles. So I'm moving on to compost use. And this is a situation where we were using roadkill compost down in Ulster County. So they actually laid the compost down on the side of the road where they needed to vegetate. They put about 3 inches down, which is a lot. But they seeded it down, and a couple months later, because that was really late in the year that they put it down, a couple months later, we had grass growing on it already. So that was March. This is a situation actually in Texas where they're putting in compost blankets. And this picture just really depicts things well. They're spraying on the compost blanket, and then that builds the soil so they can use, and they tend to use native seed mixes on these, but then they can actually retain enough. Texas doesn't have excess moisture. But when they're using compost on their slopes, they can hold enough moisture in the soil so that they can plant plants and they can keep their slopes vegetated. And this was 8 months later on that slope, same slope. So it really does work well. Yes, they go into some droughts, but they're not watering these, and it's not practical to water the roadside anyway. But their aquifers were in such bad shape that they really needed to do something to vegetate the roadsides. This is another situation just along the roadside, and they were able to put all that, and that is in Texas also. This is a wetland in the Adirondacks, where we had put a landfill in there, a dump, not a landfill, a dump. And this is the mitigation process, and I worked with them to bring the proper mixes of compost in so that they could grow more bog type plants and they could restore this bog area after they took all of the garbage out of the area. And it happens to be in a meridian in the Northway. So it was a hard place to access. So the only people that went there were the DOTs and DOT people that were restoring this thing. But it really, it came out nicely. We don't get to see it, unfortunately, but at least it's fixed. We use a lot of compost socks, and this is a blower truck that actually can take a sock, and it's sock that's 12 to 24 inches in diameter. And we fill those socks up with compost medium to make gardens, and we actually can plant into these socks, or to help us with erosion control. And you'll see some of the pictures in a minute of the different erosion control. Some are filled with carbon, and they're filled with all different sizes of carbon, depending on what we want them to be used for. They're also filled with compost. Here we're spraying, I'm spraying a blanket down to get more vegetation in. And this was a bridge project where they needed to get more compost blankets in so that they could get the vegetation so that the stream wouldn't wash the bridge out again. We were also using the socks. Here are the socks, and this is another filler for compost socks, but we were using the socks so that we would actually be filtering the water that's coming off the road here and can go into the riprap. And, you know, the riprap can be washed away, but the compost socks tend to stay in place, and we do pin them in place, but they tend to get very heavy because they've got compost in them or wood chip in them, and they just absorb moisture and slowly release that. This is in a city just to keep the compost socks are used to keep junk out of the our water courses. Ditches around those. This is an erosion control situation that we were using. They had taken all the vegetation off of this corner. It's in New York State. And it's about 15 feet over the water, and it's a class 1 stream, so it's an important stream. And we needed to get it revegetated. So we put compost blankets. We sprayed compost blankets in there and then seeded that down and got everything in better shape in there. We also use compost socks in places there aren't any left in there to keep some of the road salt and some of the negative stuff off of the slope. This was an undercut bank, and you can see there's a little pipe down here. So we took these compost socks, pinned them in here, and above that was a telephone pole. The bank just kept going back and back. And this is a ditch, a roadside ditch. So it was going to take the road out. It was going to take the telephone pole out. So we pinned these socks in there, and they slow everything down. And then 4 months later, that's what it looked like. We gained more ground. We didn't lose any more of that area. So we were in good shape. This is socks being used in the ditches. So just different ways that we're using compost and wood chips for erosion control. This happened to be a class 1 stream. The other socks were up above it. And basically we can filter all the water that's going into that so that it'll protect the stream. And that's it.
Thank you, Jean. That was so interesting. I have to tell you, I just saw a compost sock for the first time the other day, and I wasn't sure that's what it was, but it was being used at a construction site. And it's a great idea. It's a great idea.
Yeah, you'll see more and more of them used everywhere in the state. I'm amazed. Once you see one, then you'll really start seeing others. We still use some hay bales and some silt fences, but they don't work very well. The hay bales are pretty good. And I think Massachusetts uses more over in your area. They use more of those, but I think they're using a lot of sock now as well. Yeah,
that's actually, it was in Mass that I saw it, right on the border of New York. Yeah. I just wondered to our participants, if you have any other questions for Jean, go ahead and put them into the chat. And in the meantime, I actually think all our participants already know this, but I did not want to forget to mention the Climate Carnival, which is July 16th from 10 to 4 at the Columbia County Fairgrounds. And Jean was kind enough to provide us with a nice bin material, and there will be a composting demonstration there, as well as handouts and many other activities as well. And it's the first annual. And the other thing I wanted to mention is that in terms of the ZeroWasteColumbia, we have a Gmail account, which is ZeroWasteColumbia@gmail.com. If anyone has further questions or wants to reach out. And there was one other question at the beginning, Jean. Someone asked if you would be willing to share your slides.
Absolutely. This is recorded, so you can use it that way. If you need a specific slide, I don't have a way to send it to you exactly. So if you tell me what you need, if you need the whole thing, I probably should get this one on the website so people can download it anyway.
So I'll be in touch with you, and the participants, I know all of them, so we can we'll hook you up together. So that I think it was Jill that asked.
Absolutely, and I have so much, so feel free to ask, and I probably can give you. We had a great artist. He has passed since, but he does a lot of wonderful work for us. We did a lot of wonderful work for us in a very light style that really depicts things well.
So Jill has another question. She wants to be a composter, and she wondered what's the best way of having a hands-on buddy. In other words, someone to, kind of get her started. And I'm thinking probably community garden, but Jean, I'd be interested to hear what you have to say.
Yeah, community gardens, I would, the best way to learn is just to start doing it. So play and start small. I would, if you are in a place where you can use a wire bin, use that wire bin and encourage your neighbors to bring stuff. If you're interested in that, if you want the compost for your gardens. It's a good way to do it. I did do a master composters course years ago in Columbia County and Westchester County. I've done it. We can do some of those where we'll do like 6 hours. So you have, and actually physically do some of the work, build bins or start preparing and making compost. U.S. Compost Council also has a course. And that's, it'll come back to New York. I don't know when, but that's something that, we actually build compost bins, make them work, and get heat in them by the end of the week. So it's a week-long course.
Wow. And did you say that was in Massachusetts?
No, we did that in Cobleskill at Cornell.
Okay.
But it's US Compost Council. It's held all over the country.
Oh,
We
okay.
just bring it to New York every once in a while. And I need to tell them to get the course coming here again.
Come back. Yeah.
Yeah. So we've done it, I think, 5 times in New York already. And
Well,
yeah, it's, yeah.
They
Maureen,
think
you
that,
wanted to mention something else that you told me earlier, and that was that you have food scrap collection, or you have places that you can bring your food scraps to.
yes, and I probably read it too quickly, but Columbia County Solid Waste Department now has, my understanding, at every station, every dump waste station, sorry, there is a place where you can bring your compost. And there's a flyer that we have distributed, and it's on their website, which tells you what materials they want and what they will not want in the compost. And so that's something that's it's a pilot program. It was initially only at 2 stations, but I read today that it is supposed to be at all of them now around the county.
Great.
So that's another way if people are not able. I've sometimes heard people say that they have they just can't do compost at their home, and that's another way of doing it.
Yep.
So thank you for reminding me.
It's a great way to participate. Yeah.
Yeah, it is. It is. And then, it's the compost is going to organizations or businesses that are able to put it into, back into the ground, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
There's a long question here from Lisa, and I'm just going to read it. Can you tell me if you are aware of any community composting programs that you are impressed by? I've tried to get my climate smart community interested in composting, including scrap pickup programs, and have not been successful so far. Are there any that you can tell us about that you really have been impressed about?
I think the best way to get people involved is, and they're not going to be involved in composting unless they actually like to grow things. It's really hard to get people to, if they have no interest in the environment and no interest in growing plants, even house plants or outside plants, they're probably not going to compost that easily. But having more food security gardens and community gardens gets people, increases the awareness, and then more people might want to. I'm working with somebody that we built raised beds and they built raised beds, and we're putting making soil mixes and putting soil mixes in there. And she's just inviting neighbors to, giving them buckets and saying, come on over and garden, and just making a community garden in the middle of kind of nowhere. So that people are doing that. There's a tree program, and I did have some slides of trees grown with compost that I've missed there. And just planting trees is another reason to be making compost, because you'll get tremendous growth on those trees when you use compost when you're starting trees out.
That actually reminds me, in Austerlitz, we've done a buffer in a bag program, which comes, I believe, from the DEC. And we planted, I think it was about 25 trees along a stream bed in order to prevent erosion.
That's great.
If you did, Lisa, they only do it in the spring each year, and then they run out of trees, but perhaps you could interest your group in doing it that way. So it would be helping to reduce, drainage, helping drainage problems, but also, you could use the compost around the trees. That would be a great way to make them grow.
Right, right.
The other question.
There's another program called Trees That Feed.
Um,
And that's a great program to have, whether it's maple trees that you're gonna get syrup out of, or apple trees, or other things that people can actually pick as they're walking along the road. And eat. It's a neat program that happens in a lot of countries.
Yeah, yeah. Lisa had another question too. How do you feel about leaves as compost brown? I find that they take so long to break down.
Yes, they do. As long as you're mixing up the different leaves, your maples, your oaks, your, evergreens, all that kind of stuff, they'll eventually go. Some people will mow over them. So we have a whole study that we did on mulch mowing, and that means you're mulching over your leaves. You're mowing over your leaves and leaving as much as you can as mulch in your gardens and on the actual soil, so that you're adding organic matter in that way. So actually mowing your leaves and then putting them in the compost pile, or if you can, leaving them right on the lawn. It's a neat way to do it, and you'll find information about that on our website.
I used to do that at my home previous that I had, and it worked really great. And we didn't have to rake those leaves.
There's a program in Westchester County called Love 'em and Leave 'em. So it's leaving the leaves on there, and of course we want to do that with our grass clippings also, because we need that organic matter back in the soil.
Absolutely. I would say last call for any questions or comments. And I'll just say, Jean, you are just such a wonderful speaker. We enjoy you so much.
Good.
And I would love to have you come down and give us an in-person composting seminar, or whatever you want to call it. So maybe sometime we can get you down here.
Work with Cooperative Extension, and we'll see if we can do a master composter day or something like that.
Oh yeah, that's a great idea. Mm-hmm.
We can do that, and that's a good way to do it. Sometimes I'm just, I just do like a day, 6 hours or something like that on different topics, composting topics, and just come down for a day and put it in the Master Gardeners program.
That sounds great. That's a great idea. I will reach out to them. So thank you, everyone. Again, thank you to Thea for being our host, and thank you to everyone who attended. And this program has been recorded. So as soon as it's, I think usually it's edited a little bit, and then we'll put it out so that everybody can access it. Did I remember to ask you, you did say the slides. Yeah, I asked you that question. Never mind. That's good. Sorry. All right. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Jean, so much.
Thank you.
And have a good
to
summer.
talk with you.
Take care.
Yeah. Bye-bye.